Final Mile podcast on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Results Driven Agriculture Research. Find out more by going to ardar.ca. And welcome back to another episode of the Final Mile podcast brought to you by Ardar. We've got two guests today. We're going to talk about a topic that has really, irrigation has changed the production capabilities of an area like Southern Alberta. There are many areas around the world that have irrigation. I personally grew up in Picture Butte, Alberta, where irrigation played a substantial role in not only attracting people to the area, but also industry, and the result has been a tremendous benefit to the Alberta economy. Let's bring in our guests, and we're going to talk about the impact of irrigation, kind of maybe where we go into the future. Up first, we have John Kolk. He is with Kolk Farms, and he is a farmer from Picture Butte, Alberta. I've known John for a long time. And John, it's great to have you here on the Final Mile podcast.
Great to see you, Shaun.
Yeah, and John, give us some of your background. And a long resume, but let's hear some of the things you've been doing.
Also, I grew up on the farm my grandfather came over on. Used to be some, actually it was flood irrigation. I've moved irrigation pipe. I've done irrigation wheels, just like your dad and grandpa did. And then, of course, now we have pivots, and I've even worked a little bit with subsurface irrigation. So we've been farming for quite a few years in Southern Alberta. Moved from kind of a mixed farm to mostly row crop and specialty crops. And we farm in the north end of the county of Lethbridge in the Bow River Irrigation District.
Great stuff. Yeah. The move from like hand move to wheel move to pivots, and probably something we're gonna say, whoa, you didn't even talk about flood irrigation, but you just think about the advances that we have had. It's there's been a lot of innovation in this space for sure. John, you've seen a lot of that and been a big part of it in Southern Alberta. Also joining us here today is Chris Gallagher. He is the general manager with the Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District. Chris, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here, Shaun. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you.
Okay, give us some of your background.
Yeah, sure. I'm an engineer by training. I have a biological engineering degree from University of Guelph, and then moved to Alberta, and I knew it was about water here in Southern Alberta, so I actually took watershed management through Lethbridge Polytechnic. And I've spent many years in engineering consulting and quite a few years in working in a number of the irrigation districts in Southern Alberta in their engineering departments and as manager.
Okay, let's kind of dive in here. Southern Alberta's farms, like I said, irrigation has played a huge role here, and there is a very substantial irrigation network that has been, there's a lot of infrastructure here. It's, a lot of times we just sort of see, the pivot operating, and that's great. And we don't think naturally about all the stuff that's happening in the background. So the region of Southern Alberta is supported by nearly 8,000 kilometers of irrigation canal and 57 water storage reservoirs that divert water from river systems like the Old Man and the Bow. So because of all this infrastructure, there's roughly 1.7 million acres, okay? That works out to, do a bit of research here, that works out to about 4.4% of Alberta's cultivated farmland are now irrigated. Yet, irrigation accounts for around 28% of Alberta's agri-food GDP and contributing about $5.4 billion annually when direct and supply chain impacts are included. So, John, the last few growing seasons have really tested the limits of water supply in Southern Alberta. There's been a lot of talk about this. From a producer's perspective, what has felt different when making some of your cropping, choices or investment and risk management decisions under tighter and more, uncertain water conditions?
Yeah, so Shaun, a number of things that happened. I mean, one, we look at our cropping rotation mix. So can we put some pulses into our crops or into our rotation that take a bit more or less water? Maybe we drop the double cropping. We're pretty careful on how much corn we might put in. So we're looking at if there's a reduction in water supply or an anticipated one, we kind of balance our rotation. So that's kind of our first step. Now, there's a whole bunch of steps before that. Low pressure pivots that we've put in years ago, variable rate pivots that we've put in. So there's been choices made beforehand that help us address something like this. We're just not dumping. I often use the example. My grandfather grew 50 bushels of barley on about 28 inches of water because he flooded. We last year did about a 140 bushel crop, and we didn't have much rain in the beginning of the season. And we put about 8 inches on. Now we did get an extra 2 inches in later on. So with a 10 to 12 inch, we were able to produce a whole lot more. And that's because of technology, genetics, and management. So you've got to put a lot of pieces together, Shaun, and I think you know that, you've seen it. Uh, you got to put a lot of pieces together, and you got to keep your eyes open. What's coming up next, and what's going to help us get further down the road?
So Chris,
Mhm.
all the different irrigation farmers inside of a district are trying to to manage maybe a possible reduction in supply, or maybe it's it's a regular year and they're thinking about different crop types to maximize some of the returns. When you aggregate all that, how does that impact the management of an irrigation district?
Yeah, well, there's two different ways to look at it. One is on an annual basis, and then on a regular basis through the operating season. So, on an annual basis, or actually even multi-year, we're looking at the water supply. So we look at what's available in the mountains, snowpack, what's available already in the reservoirs, and then making some careful decisions about the allocations that we're able to set under the rules within the Irrigation Districts Act. And that's to ensure we don't overpromise and underdeliver on the volume of water that's available. So we set allocations based on the water that's available. But of course, a lot of that comes as rain in the spring as well. So we sometimes have to make initial allocations that are a little bit lower and then gradually increase through the year as our confidence increases that the water is going to be there for farmers. But what we have to be cognizant of is exactly what John's talking about, is the impact on farm. Is sure, it'd be easy for us to set a very low allocation at the beginning of the year and then increase it. But a lot of those on-farm decisions, which crops to seed and how to manage that water, they need to know that early in the irrigation season. So we're challenged with close monitoring and providing regular updates on the water situation, so that we can give a higher level of confidence to the farmer that they're going to have enough water to grow their crops all the way through the season.
And Chris, I mentioned earlier this move from flood, the inefficiencies of that,
Mhm.
to hand move, huge laborious component to that.
Yeah.
Wheel move, everybody felt, John, we felt like we had died and gone to heaven. We got wheel move. Like, you mean these wheels move this pipe and I don't need to carry these stupid pipes anymore? And then, and I remember growing up, well, how many lines do you move on how many? There's this, we just never slept is what happened. And then we moved to pivots. So with all of that has come more effective use of labor. But I think most importantly, we are so much better in terms of the efficiency and how using as much more, we're less evaporation, like less water loss. We are much more effective for every liter that we have access to, right, Chris? Like it's actually substantial.
Yeah, and there's been most of that savings has actually been on farm, but there's also a substantial amount that we've done in the irrigation districts and the Alberta government and the headwork systems management as well, to get more crop per drop, and a lot of that has been we've picked a lot of the low hanging fruit, which is converting a lot of the old inefficient, leaky, seeping canals and converting them to closed buried pipelines.
Yeah.
That's made a substantial improvement in our irrigation conveyance efficiency, basically how much water we divert at the river compared to what actually gets applied to the land. And also minimizing the amount of operational spill, which is the water that's diverted and then ends up going back out at the bottom end of the system. So we've improved our irrigation infrastructure. We've lined a lot of the big canals. We've put a lot of the smaller canals into pipeline. And now we're starting to get diminishing returns. But there's still opportunities to continue to improve our efficiencies.
From an on-farm perspective, John, how have these transitions in delivery, how have they impacted you, and how, with the benefits that you've seen?
A bunch of things. I just I'm right next door where Chris does a bunch of his work. They put automation in, so they're automating the canals. So with a phone call or whatever on an app, they can address it. We're doing the same on our pivots. We actually received some money through a Alberta Irrigation Efficiency Grant at one point. So we have a lot of apps. What we don't have right now is a connection between the district's automation and our automation.
Hmm.
And I think when Chris talks about, hey, we're making progress, but we got more to go, it's going to be integrating those things at some point so that we can get tighter and tighter. So when Chris delivers a gallon of water, I get most of that gallon of water on the land. So that's where we're going to still find some efficiencies. We're doing stuff on how we apply it. And as Chris said, the efficiencies with low pressure, with droplet rotators,
Yeah.
all of those incremental things have really improved what we're doing. But now we've got to maybe move to the next step. Once the pipelines are all in, and I think that there's going to be some more opportunities yet.
Yeah, remember the impact sprinklers on top of the pivots? And just, you think, like, at the time it was like, this makes total sense. Now we're like, oh my goodness, between the wind and the sun and lots of loss, right? But I think it shows the irrigation sector has innovated quickly as they've sought out productivity and efficiency, and like really made changes fast, and farmers have adopted those changes, I think, rather quickly, Chris.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, we've been able to expand our irrigation districts and actually increase the intensity of water use with the longer growing seasons and double cropping and that kind of thing in closed basins. Like the basins have been closed to new allocations since 2004, John, I think,
I think so.
something like that in the early to mid 2000s there. And so we're actually expanding and growing more with the same amount of water.
Hmm.
And actually even less, because as districts are continuing to see improvements in efficiencies, we're reserving a portion of that savings to improve the resiliency of the district and protect against times of drought.
So for you, John, we've talked a little bit about the delivery of the water, but the automation of it is also something we really haven't chatted about when we talk about some of the technology, pivot automation, soil moisture sensing. We get, there's obviously drip. There's a lot of different areas here. How has that impacted the complexity of the management of it, instead of just pivot on? There's a lot more to it now to do it properly. So talk about the management decision, how this technology has impacted you, John.
Well, number one, it's not cheap. So there's a fair amount of cost, and there's a risk to going that next step. We found out with subsurface irrigation, which we tried some, you almost need a person focused on it because it's a different way of doing things than low pressure pivots. The other thing is, how do crops respond? And that's, if I see a gap in the research side of things, is our genetics are different, our climate's somewhat different, how we apply is different. And can we get more, if we understand better how the plant uses the water and the potato guys are doing some great work on that. But if we understand that better, maybe we can get closer and closer to just putting the amount of water on that we need to grow the maximum amount of tons or grain. There's a gap there, and that's where we do need some research, and that's public good research. That's not necessarily something that's going to land in my pocket right now, but over time, it's important for the entire area and for the irrigation districts.
Yeah.
So we're making, you got to keep learning. Of course, it's getting a bit more complex, but we also have better tools than we used to have.
Yeah. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like the automation side, I think that's really important because we need to understand how the farmers are using the water. We provide a number of rules and that type of thing, like 24 hours sets minimum, so that water's not turning on and off and on and off. It gives more predictability because there is quite a bit of travel time from where it's diverted from the river to where it's at final use. And so we need to know ahead of time what the farmer wants to do. I know Richard Phillips at Bow River there has talked a lot about we don't need flow meters so much at the farm gate. We need brain meters. We need to know what the farmer's thinking and when they're going to use the water. And so we've actually started to think about that. We've actually got a project right now that's funded through results-driven agriculture research, where we're looking at using artificial intelligence and machine learning along with some of what John's talking about with crop demand models and irrigation scheduling to better predict what's going to happen so that we can send the right amount of water down the canal for when it's needed. So it's almost like that 4R principle with crop management, the right product at the right
Yeah.
time, the right place, the right amounts. And so we're trying to do the same thing as an irrigation district to get the right water at the right time for the farmers with minimal wastage. The other part of it is knowing where to store it in the system so that it's easily available when it's needed to reduce that travel time component, and then to make sure we're not at risk of spilling. Like we've got in our system, we've got the Old Man River Dam, which is our main supply source that's operated and owned by the province. And then we've got the Kehoe Reservoir, which is more of a balancing reservoir. If that's maintained too full too early in the season, we're liable to spill to try and protect the dam. If we manage that more responsibly, and we have a model to support that, we're going to do a better job of using that licensed volume of water.
So the technology you're talking about here is where the systems talk is moving away from John the farmer calls in and says, hey, pivot on this quarter, I need water. Is that the system we're still using?
Pretty close. Yeah, we have phone and text into our water coordinator. We have a 24 within 24 hours delivery to the farm gate target. Usually we can do better than that. But yeah, and then it's just the water coordinator then manages the water infrastructure, the canal gates and all that type of thing to get the water there when they need it. Sometimes there's delays. But what we're eventually moving to, and some of the districts are already doing this, is to actually have online water ordering processes so that they can plan their irrigation scheduling, enter it into the system, and then we can have our system better able to respond and provide that water when they need it.
John, one of the things that I've picked up from growers of today here in 2026 versus 2006 is a lot more attention to detail in the delivery of the how much when. We're out of the business of recreational irrigating. Do you know what I mean? Where we didn't know a lot. We just crop and probably through, I guess, maybe interested in your perspective here, John. One of the benefits of some of the water restrictions the past number of years, it's forced us a little bit probably to be thinking more and more about some of the precisionness of how much water do I need to apply to this crop type based on the variables in the season. Would you agree with that?
Shaun, I think we moved from a space where there was 24 inches of water available and you didn't think about the limits.
Yeah.
Now we've moved to limits, and you're right. When some districts had to go down to 8 or 12 inches, all of a sudden every farmer is thinking limits. The interesting thing is once you start putting a limit on, you're going to start measuring. Once you're starting to measure, you're going to have to figure out how to price it. And so that's driving management decisions, but it's also driving sensors and measurement devices. So when we didn't really worry about how much, when the air is free, we don't really worry about it. When the water was so-called free, no limits, we didn't spend the time on it. Now we're spending some time on it because you say, hey, if we're, Chris knows when I'm hitting 11 and a half inches and it's a 12-inch year. And I'm worried about it and he's worried about it because I can't go over it and he can't afford to give more to one entity than another. So as we get closer, we start measuring more. And I think some of the sensors are much cheaper. Level measurements, in soil measurements, all of those things have come down in price. Connecting them up, it's like precision farming. We're collecting a lot of data, and now we've got to put that data together so that we can make actionable decisions. And I think we're getting closer. And I think the work that Chris and LNID and ARDA are doing is interesting because they're starting to say, if we look at weather, if we look at flow rates, if we look at evaporation, cropping time, you put those pieces together, all of a sudden he can start getting tighter to what the farmer requires.
Well, and with all of what John's talking about there, Chris, driving home what techniques, practices, technologies in this irrigation ecosystem drives return on investment, right? Like that gets us closer because once we're able to summarize things based on return on investment, it's a lot simpler from an efficacy standpoint of the information. Like that to me is a real key transition point here.
Well, absolutely. I mean, price is a driver, and it's not just in terms of the commodity prices and that type of thing. It's actually the value of water itself.
Yeah.
Water licenses, transfers within the southern basins here, it's gotten very, very expensive. Irrigation districts as well have increased the costs on their capital assets charges. So farmers that want to add new acres, there's limitations on that and increasing costs. And then we've got a bit of a virtual water market, even that when John was saying when guys are starting to reach the limit on the allocation for a field, they can turn around and buy water allocation from another farmer within that district to transfer that water and move it around to the fields that have the higher value crops, the ones that have contracts, for potatoes, for sugar beets, that type of thing. So there's a water market where the value of water gets moved around to where it's affordable. And that type of resilience is something that we're responding to as well, recognizing that the intensity of water use, as I mentioned, is increasing. People are getting more value out of their land by using that water wisely.
That makes sense. So, John, from your perspective, what actually determines whether a new technology is adopted or ignored by farmers?
Well, my cynical side could come out. If somebody's developing something for $1 and selling it to me for 10, I'm probably thinking I'm not going to buy into it.
Yeah.
We see too much of that in the ag sector, promises of slippery water or wetter water, things like that. So I think farmers have learned to be a bit hesitant, but actual seeing what happens. So whether it's some stuff that's been done at the irrigation demo farm, some stuff that they're doing at Lethbridge Polytech or other areas, I've got to be able to see that it makes a difference. and there's leading farmers and organizations, extension organizations that do some of this work. Um, I I think, I mean, at the end of the day, some of the earlier stuff that we've done on our farm, for instance, variable rate irrigation, doesn't work under today's climate. Okay, it's too expensive uh, for what we need to do. But if I get a benefit because I can put water on more land or anything like that, at some point it will be, the payoff's got to show up somewhere. And so I did it just to see, can we do a better job? And indeed, we can probably drop 15% of our water use with variable rate. I'd like to have instantaneous reads, and there's some companies that are doing that. But if you're adding $80,000 onto a quarter section, you better find some savings. And it's not going to be how much electricity you use or the cost of water. It's going to be something else than that. So the payment can come, but it's going to take a little while to get there. And it takes different thinking. Chris talks about, we've got, in essence, some virtual water markets. That will continue down the road, and then there will be payoffs for these higher end, expensive options. And sometimes, like with SCAP, you've got to salt the oats a little bit, and that's what the government's done with some irrigation efficiency stuff. You throw a little salt on the oats, and people will drink the water after that, right? So check it out, and we've done it. Other farmers have done it and been successful, and all of a sudden it becomes the way we all do it because now it's proven. But new technology, every farmer's got something in the back of the field that was new technology, and you had to dump it after a year and a half because it just didn't work.
Yeah. Well, and the monitoring of that's the important part, right? And you've already mentioned, John, Alberta's on-farm irrigation efficiency grants, and the benefits there to help farmers with adoption. Chris, does a district like the LNID, do they do testing or research? Like, would you ever recommend to water users, hey, we've tested this and this technology really seems to work, or you just stay out of that game?
Yeah, well, we refer.
Okay.
But we're happy to host as well and connect researchers with growers and help facilitate that, because it is something that we understand does impact our irrigation efficiencies and the way we monitor or manage water. But I just wanted to tag on one of John's points there, just in terms of like with variable rate irrigation and other efficiencies, is that helps on farm, but that doesn't actually result in saved water unless the district is able to capture that water that would otherwise go on the field. So that's one of the challenges that we deal with, is that, and that's a vulnerability in LNID in particular, is we have limited ability to balance water at the downstream end of our system. So if the farmer doesn't use it, it's going to the river anyway. Unless we advance the automation and control systems, use our gates and gates in our canals and automate them and use them as like linear balancing reservoirs so that we can absorb surges by raising the gates and then release it again, lowering the gates. And that requires a more educated workforce as well. Our water coordinators are better trained than they ever were in terms of managing infrastructure, SCADA, communication systems, that type of thing. We're also looking for opportunities for micro storage, whether it's on-farm reservoirs, and we've seen a lot of that where farmers have put in their own storage systems so that they can irrigate earlier and later, but it also allows some absorption of that, recapturing that spill. And so we're continuing to look at all of those opportunities to squeeze that last bit of drop out of our water licenses, and so that they're put to good use.
Yeah, great point, because I think, you talked about we moved from canals to closed pipelines, but that doesn't mean it's a closed loop, right? We still need to manage that flow through the system and all the users. because it's not like, it gets to the end of the line and we have, we circle it all the way back. And maybe I'll ask, why don't we do that?
Well, the basic answer is water flows downhill, and all our canals are on grade, and in order to reuse it, you got to pump it,
Okay.
or you have to have a base of acres downstream of your capture point that can use it. And so again, we're looking for those kind of opportunities that, like I said, the low-hanging fruit's been picked. We're trying to look through and find these other opportunities. The other significant thing we're doing is we're getting away from risk aversion towards risk management of our reservoirs and our canals. So it used to be, well, let's just be really conservative and operate the reservoirs in a certain way that protects against, controls for dam safety and that kind of thing. Well, maybe the way we operate needs to change so that we rebalance that risk and because what happens when we reduce allocations and restrict farmers, you're putting all the risk on the farmer if you aren't using the reservoirs properly. Those storage reservoirs are not wide canals. They're intended to supply water in times of shortage and store water in terms of surplus. And if we're not using that properly, the risk is unbalanced towards the farmer. And so that's the other thing what we're working on, improving communications with the government of Alberta on the government reservoirs. There's a lot more we can continue to do over and above the longer term prospects for adding new reservoirs to the system to capture Alberta's share of the water.
So John, with all this research that's happening, how are research findings and innovations being translated into practice in a way that producers can, there's high amounts of efficacy, they trust it, and we're increasing the, I guess, the wealth of knowledge about, what to do or not to do. Like, talk about that from your perspective.
Oh, yeah. It's a little bit of a tough one. I think recognizing what Southern Alberta has and Alberta has is, I mean, we've got good governance right from working with the Alberta government, people who handle the front of the reservoirs, how the irrigation districts, they actually have farmers on the board. So there's that governance piece where you got experts like Chris, but there's also farmers on the board to recognize. So there is interconnects that are pretty solid. Plus, we have a bit of an ecosystem of the extension services that still go through Farming Smarter and
Yeah.
other entities. But how I I think we're fortunate that we have a fairly high level of trust. We have partnerships, okay, right to the polytechs and government, whether it's environment or agriculture. So there's a fairly high level of trust. So information moves a bit more quickly. Um, so I don't know. It's not an easy one to answer,
Yeah.
Shaun. I think I when you talk to people from other areas of the world, you take a look and say, we're pretty fortunate how this is going here. And the fact that we still have some ongoing support on the innovation and research side. And we have to keep pushing. I mean, we need to do a better job of showing what the value of irrigation is to Alberta and Canada. And AIDA, I understand, will do some of that
So,
in
John,
the next while.
is there people that don't see the benefits of irrigation? Like, maybe I'm just living. I grew up in the ecosystem here, so I'm sort of like, this seems like a natural, like, duh. But is this? Am I missing something?
Do you know, I've done this for a few years, Shaun, and every time we get a new minister of agriculture, you've got to go up to Edmonton and you've got to encourage them to understand what it really means. You got to get them out here. Same thing federally. The
Mm.
the understanding of the impact is, I mean, they can see the numbers, but they have to kind of get out here and see it. And there's multiple demands, whether it's drainage or roads or healthcare, education. There's multiple demands, and to get that message out of how critical and important, and see, Canada has a lot of water. But around the world, about 30% of cropping is done with irrigation. We don't have anywhere near those kind of numbers. Um, and so we don't really, we get enough rain generally, other than southern Alberta, to be able to produce crops. So yes, we have to keep talking. I think something you're going to find interesting is you're going to see irrigation farmers up in Vermilion or Fort Vermilion coming off the Peace River. You're going to see irrigation farmers thinking in different areas. They won't have the same structures that we have. We've got coming off the mountains and the canals and everything else. They're going to have to do it differently. But water is so critical to investing into improving agricultural production.
Yeah.
We're going to see more of it across the country. And so I don't think that recognition is coming yet. We're doing a pretty good job down here of tooting our own horn. I mean, we've got people like Chris and others that understand this, but the next step is going to be what they're doing in other parts of the world.
Well, and I've always, people that don't, that live outside of an irrigation area, they'll always say, well, like, man, if you got irrigation, you got no problems. No, you have problems. They're just different problems. And they just sort of look at you a little bit. I'm like, trust me, it's not as it doesn't solve all your issues, but it does take away one of the big risk factors, which is Mother Nature relative to moisture, for sure. Chris, to this discussion is, I guess, we've seen provincially, we've seen federally, a push to expand the amount of irrigated acres. And what I sometimes hear, or what I may hear from people listening to this, is, well, wait a minute, how can we be talking about expanding irrigation acres in the province when we're also at the same time concerned about we're limiting people on how much water they get? Can we do both of those at the same time, or break that down? Because I think that's an issue for some of the listeners.
Well, absolutely, we can do both. But we need to recognize that the situation has changed, right? We need to deal with the changing environment and climate, longer growing seasons, and that type of thing, and just recognize that. Well, first of all, the water that is available to expand is not new water. This is water that's saved through conservation efficiency initiatives. So things like the low pressure drop tube sprinklers and the conversion of canals to pipelines. And the approach that we're using is we bank the savings first and then demonstrate it through modeling. And then we have to go through a plebiscite with the water users to make sure that they understand what the risks are associated with expansion, and then get that approved. And then we are allowed to then start selling irrigation acres. So there's quite a process that's involved. But it's also recognizing that we're not the only users of this water. And we've got a lot of neighbors with an interest in water and value water differently. And we need to learn to respect that. And that's something we've been doing a lot more of, being more involved with our WPACs, the Water Planning and Advisory Councils, Old Man Watershed Council, Bow River Basin Council, recognizing nature-based solutions, natural asset management, opportunities to work with the aquatic environment, things like cottonwood recruitment. People may not realize that, but when there's opportunities to use, when there's supply available, the drawdown of the outflows from the Old Man River is actually slowed down so that the water table drops only at the rate that the roots of the cottonwood can follow them. And so and it can't happen every year, but in a good water supply year, we actually work with the aquatic biologists, the riparian managers, that type of thing, to look for those kind of opportunities in a river scale, but also within our own district.
So, John, again, to reinforce this point, we don't need to name all of them, but there's a significant amount of crop types that we would not see in southern Alberta if it weren't for irrigation. Like, it's not like we're enhancing what we would have been growing. And, yeah, we would see wheat. Yes. But we wouldn't see corn, wouldn't see potatoes, wouldn't see dry beans. Like, there's the list goes on, John.
Probably have about 50 different crops here. And instead of the 8 that might be across the rest of the prairies, um, other than part of southern Manitoba, really, it's irrigation that gives us mint and seed canola and
Yeah.
sugar beets and the very impressive livestock industry. Wouldn't be happening if we didn't have this irrigation going on to be able to, if you guarantee your water, you can actually grow cattle. If you don't have water, you're not going to be able to do it. So um, I think that the argument for the value to society that irrigation and efficient irrigation does, that's there. I mean, we have to keep adding it out. I think what Chris mentioned is that we need to be also transparent about the other aspects, because water is a holistic part of a system. So whether it's the biodiversity component, whether it's the cottonwood trees, we need to make sure that that's a play. I mean, you would not have the waterfowl that we have in southern Alberta if it wouldn't be for the irrigation districts. Because there's no natural water or water ponds out there that are long term other than Waterton Lake. Everything else is pretty well attached to an irrigation system and an irrigation district. So, getting out there to let people know how we add value. What we're dealing with is, with a limited resource, management becomes more critical. And it's not just the management of the water, it's the wider management of the ecosystem that we're living in.
Okay, so on that note, Chris, what have these past few years where it's pretty strong dry bias? What has that revealed about some of the vulnerabilities on the farm and in our irrigation system that we need to maybe close some of those gaps on?
Yeah. So, yeah, in terms of vulnerabilities, I mean, it's there's some infrastructure vulnerabilities for sure that we've identified. Part of the drought that we were dealing with was actually self-inflicted. We had some issues with the main canal, the Lethbridge Northern Edwards Canal, with liner repairs that have been done. So that's one of our Achilles heels, right? Is if that goes down, then we've got no water supply. And we did have to deal with that in 1 year where it was delayed for a period of time. But it's also, we're very vulnerable to the fluctuations, that variability. And then in terms of drought, I mean, 2024 was the first year that LNID, like since the construction of the Old Man Dam, the first time LNID has not increased our allocation to our full 17.5-inch unreserved amount. 2024 was the first year. We started at 8 inches, went to 11 inches, and then finished at 13 as the water supply situation improved. And in 2024, we used a different approach. We basically took our best guess at what we think we were going to have, rebalanced that risk between farmer and reservoir, set 14 inches, and held it for the whole year. So those are the kind of things that we need to look at in terms of what are we vulnerable to, in-season variability, as well as the possibility. And we know from tree ring data that we will have multi-year droughts at some point in the future. So we have to be prepared for that as well.
Yeah. So just on that, the aging infrastructure, and there's a lot of focus right now in Canada about, hey, we can't build stuff. So are there issues with obviously there's cost issues with upgrading infrastructure, but are there other issues tied to the upgrading of infrastructure as the years move on?
Oh, for sure. And in terms of infrastructure management, that's something that we have really looked at. A number of irrigation districts are doing this as well, is adopting what large municipalities have been doing for years, which is a detailed asset management program. So they know all of their infrastructure, they have regular condition evaluations on them, and then they prioritize the rehabilitation or modernization upgrading according to cost, according to the risk of failure and the consequences of failure. For example, we had a pipe break on a twin 48-inch line last year in LNID. Fortunately for us, it was at the very end of the season and had very little impact. But if that had happened during peak irrigation system, it could have been disastrous for some of our farmers. So we actually did internal camera inspections this year to
Hmm.
identify whether this was a localized issue or more long term. We're going to be doing more of that. You look at the Bears Paw feeder main failure in the city of Calgary.
Yeah.
We have two or three pipelines within our district made of that same pre-stressed concrete material. And so we, again, inspected that. So there's pipelines have been put in place for about 30 years. They're forecast to last about 100, but we don't know what we don't know. And so we need to do more detailed condition evaluations, asset management, and make wise, targeted investment decisions to make good use of our in-house engineering and construction staff, um, but also to manage our capital reserve so that we can continue to afford to build and rebuild this infrastructure.
So before we wrap up here, it is the Final Mile podcast, which rumors circulate in here, John, that you had a lot to do with the naming of the Final Mile. It's a phrase that you use often. John, we'll start with you. When it comes to irrigation in the province of Alberta, for you, what's the final mile that needs to be tackled and considered?
Look, I think it starts with knowledge and understanding. So some of that is we need better information on crop usages, and I talked about that earlier. I think secondly, it's going to be some governance and policy work. But to do that, to build confidence, you need to prove it. So you need to have the right models. You need to have the coordination between the different areas. And then lastly, the opportunity to test some of the newer stuff out there.
Mm.
And that's when I make an investment decision, is I see it at the Ag Expo, and now I'm taking a look at it and saying, will this work? And so sometimes that's an understanding of the cost side of things and return on investment. Today, you wouldn't even think twice about putting a low impact, low pressure pivot up,
Yeah.
if that's been proven. But you might think twice about active measurement of soil moisture, because that's pretty expensive right now, needs to be proved. I've got some equipment on some pivots that doesn't work anymore, so those ones, but they're going to get there. And it's that piece between the technology is there, it needs to work on the farm, putting those two pieces together. And that takes the private sector, it takes probably the academic researcher sector, and it takes some farmers willing to be a bit innovative and take a risk on it.
Yeah, and we need the irrigation sector to have a loud voice here, because it could be very easy for somebody to be like, well, wait a minute, it's only this amount of acres. but need to consider like the economic driver, like and that cannot, that is just naturally understated how much of an economic driver as you drive around a place like Southern Alberta, whether it's in the LNID or out, in Tabor area, Vauxhall, all those different spots. Now, Chris, for you, what's the final mile?
Well, I think part of it is protecting what we have, whether it's the infrastructure that we have, whether it's our water licenses, the governance around that, the Water Act, Irrigation Districts Act, because that water availability engagement we had recently, there was talk of potentially clawing back some of our licenses until they realized that they're actually right-sized already. But so just protecting what we have and then working smarter um, as well as harder. There's been a lot with canals to pipelines. You look at the strategy for the future that the government put out about 10 years ago that said to have all technically feasible pipelines in the ground by 2035. The AIM program, this combined Government of Alberta grant and the Canada Infrastructure Bank loan, along with the Irrigation District's contribution, accelerated that, made that actually more possible that we're going to get there. But that's working harder on technologies we know work. Now we're getting into the automation, total canal control, using this water modeling, using these online dashboards for irrigation scheduling, ordering, tracking. Working smarter along with working hard, I think that's really what's going to get us that final mile.
Cool research being done, as you mentioned, that project with Ardar. Very neat stuff. Looking forward to hearing how that works out, and just if you make it work consistently, what value that it does provide the whole, just not the users, but the entire system. Guys, this has been a lot of fun talking irrigation for an hour. Really do appreciate it. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome, Shaun.
And John, all the best to you.
You bet. Take care.
That's another
Sounds
episode
good.
of the Final Mile podcast. If you have any feedback or further questions about irrigation, maybe you didn't grow up in the space and you got some thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Until next time, cheers, everybody. The Final Mile podcast on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Results Driven Agriculture Research. Find out more by going to ardar.ca.